Iran's oil lifeline is failing. For decades, oil has been the backbone of Iran's economy. It has funded government budgets, paid for subsidies, supported the national currency, and allowed the state to survive international pressure. But today, that lifeline is rapidly weakening. Iran's oil crisis is no longer just about sanctions or exports. It is about structural collapse, deep mismanagement, and an economy pushed to the brink. As inflation races toward 50% and state finances crumble, many analysts now argue that Iran's economic condition is approaching, and in some social aspects even exceeding, the shock experienced during Russia's post-Soviet collapse. This is not a temporary downturn. It is a systemic breakdown. Iran sits on one of the world's largest proven oil and gas reserves, yet ordinary Iranians are struggling to afford basic necessities. This contradiction defines the current crisis. While oil should be Iran's economic shield, it has instead become a symbol of failure. Years of sanctions have restricted access to global markets, but internal corruption, outdated infrastructure, and political priorities have magnified the damage. Oil revenue no longer stabilizes the economy. It barely keeps the system breathing. The roots of the oil crisis go deeper than headlines suggest. Iran's energy sector suffers from chronic underinvestment. Modern oil production requires advanced technology, foreign expertise, and constant reinvestment. Sanctions have blocked access to Western firms and equipment, while domestic alternatives have failed to fill the gap. Fields are aging, refineries are inefficient, and production capacity is eroding. Even when Iran manages to export oil, it often does so at discounted prices, through complex channels that reduce real income. The result is a shrinking flow of usable cash into government coffers. At the same time, Iran's population continues to grow, and so do its economic demands. The government relies heavily on oil revenue to fund subsidies for fuel, food, and electricity. As oil income declines, the state prints money to cover its expenses. This has fueled runaway inflation. Prices for essentials such as bread, rice, cooking oil, rent, and medicine have surged month after month. For ordinary families, salaries no longer match living costs. Savings are wiped out quickly, and poverty expands across urban and rural areas alike. Inflation near 50% is not just a number. It is a daily reality that reshapes society. When prices change weekly or even daily, people lose trust in the currency. The Iranian rial has repeatedly collapsed, pushing citizens toward foreign currencies, gold, or informal markets. This behavior further weakens the rial, creating a vicious cycle. Businesses struggle to plan, imports become more expensive, and unemployment quietly rises. Even those with jobs feel poorer every month. This economic pressure has transformed oil from a source of national pride into a political liability. The state depends on oil to survive, yet cannot reform the sector without confronting entrenched interests. Powerful networks tied to the energy industry benefit from opaque deals, smuggling routes, and preferential access. Reform would threaten these groups, so inefficiency continues. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens pay the price through inflation, shortages, and declining public services. Comparisons to Russia's collapse in the 1990s are increasingly common, but they must be understood carefully. Russia's post-Soviet economic shock involved mass privatization, institutional breakdown, and a sudden shift to capitalism. Iran's crisis is different in structure, but similar in social impact. In both cases, state failure to manage resources destroyed public trust and living standards. However, Iran's crisis unfolds under constant sanctions, making recovery far more difficult. While Russia eventually stabilized through energy exports and global reintegration, Iran remains isolated and constrained. One of the most alarming aspects of Iran's oil crisis is how it intersects with other national emergencies. Energy shortages are now common inside an oil-rich country. Power cuts disrupt factories, businesses, and daily life. Water scarcity, environmental damage, and failing infrastructure add pressure to an already stressed population. Oil revenue once masked these weaknesses. Now, with that cushion gone, every flaw becomes visible. The government's response has largely been reactive rather than strategic. Short-term fixes replace long-term planning. Subsidies are reduced, taxes quietly increase, and currency controls tighten. These measures may delay collapse, but they deepen public frustration. When people feel trapped, unable to save, invest, or leave, social tension rises. Protests, strikes, and labor unrest have become more frequent, even if they are quickly suppressed. Economic despair does not disappear with force. It accumulates. Another critical factor is Iran's dependence on limited buyers for its oil. With many markets closed, Iran relies heavily on a small number of partners willing to purchase discounted crude. This creates vulnerability. Buyers gain leverage while Iran loses bargaining power. Revenue becomes unpredictable, and payment methods are often restricted or delayed. Oil may still flow, but its economic impact is far weaker than before. What makes Iran's situation particularly dangerous is the absence of a clear exit strategy. Economic reform would require political compromise, transparency, and reintegration into global markets. Yet ideological rigidity and regional tensions block such moves. As long as oil revenue is treated as a survival tool rather than a development engine, the economy will continue to decay. Inflation will remain high, public confidence will erode, and the middle class will shrink further. In this context, claims of bankruptcy are not exaggerations, but warnings. While the state still functions, its financial foundation is cracked. Oil no longer guarantees stability. Instead, it exposes the limits of an economic model built on control rather than productivity. Iran's oil crisis is not just worse than expected, it is redefining the country's future. And unless fundamental changes occur, the next stages of collapse may be even more severe: inflation, bankruptcy, and the collapse of daily life. While oil revenue once concealed Iran's economic weaknesses, inflation has now exposed them in brutal detail. Inflation near, and in many cases above, 50% is not merely an economic statistic. It represents a slow-motion collapse of daily life. Every sector of society feels its impact, from the poorest households to the once stable middle class. What makes Iran's situation especially dangerous is that inflation is no longer a temporary shock. It has become a permanent condition, signaling deep structural failure and pushing the country closer to de facto bankruptcy. At the core of Iran's inflation crisis lies government overspending combined with shrinking income. As oil revenues decline and sanctions restrict access to foreign currency, the state increasingly relies on money printing to fund its budget. This artificial expansion of the money supply fuels price increases across the economy. Each newly printed rial reduces the value of existing currency, eroding purchasing power and accelerating public mistrust in the financial system. Over time, inflation feeds on itself, becoming harder to control with every passing month. For ordinary Iranians, the consequences are devastating. Salaries are often adjusted once a year, if at all, while prices rise monthly or even weekly. Rent, food, transportation, healthcare, and education costs surge relentlessly. A family that could live modestly but securely just a few years ago now struggles to cover basic expenses. Many households are forced to cut meals, delay medical treatment, or pull children out of private schools. Economic survival replaces long-term planning, destroying hope for upward mobility. The middle class, traditionally the backbone of economic and social stability, is shrinking rapidly. Professionals such as teachers, engineers, nurses, and small business owners are falling into poverty. Savings accounts lose value almost overnight, and retirement plans become meaningless. This erosion of the middle class mirrors patterns seen during Russia's post-Soviet collapse, when inflation wiped out personal wealth and shattered public confidence in institutions. In Iran's case, however, the pressure is prolonged by sanctions and political isolation, making recovery far more elusive. Bankruptcy, in this context, does not mean the state has ceased functioning. Rather, it describes a government unable to meet its obligations without sacrificing its population's well-being. Iran struggles to fund infrastructure, healthcare, pensions, and social services at sustainable levels. Budget deficits widen, and emergency measures replace strategic planning. When a government survives by constantly borrowing from the future, through debt, inflation, or asset depletion, it signals effective insolvency. Iran's banking sector reflects this deeper crisis. Banks are burdened with bad loans, weak oversight, and limited access to international finance. Many institutions survive only through government support, creating a fragile system vulnerable to shocks. Citizens increasingly distrust banks, preferring to store wealth in foreign currency, gold, or real estate. This behavior drains liquidity from the formal economy, reducing investment and slowing growth even further. The financial system becomes a bottleneck rather than a driver of recovery. Inflation has also reshaped labor markets. Official unemployment figures fail to capture the reality of underemployment and informal work. Many people hold multiple jobs, yet remain poor. Young graduates face limited opportunities, leading to frustration and brain drain. Skilled professionals leave the country whenever possible, depriving Iran of human capital needed for reform. Those who remain often accept jobs far below their qualifications, wasting talent and lowering productivity across the economy. Comparisons to Russia's collapse become sharper when examining social consequences. In the 1990s, Russia, inflation, and economic chaos led to declining life expectancy, rising crime, and widespread despair. Iran shows similar warning signs. Economic stress contributes to mental health crises, family breakdowns, and declining birth rates. When people lose faith in economic stability, they postpone marriage, children, and major life decisions. These demographic effects can shape a nation's future for decades. Another alarming feature of Iran's inflationary spiral is its regional inequality. Wealthier urban centers may partially absorb price shocks, but rural and peripheral areas suffer disproportionately. Food insecurity increases, public services weaken, and local economies stagnate. This uneven impact deepens internal divisions and fuels resentment toward the central government. Inflation thus becomes not only an economic problem, but a political one, undermining national cohesion. The government's attempts to manage inflation often worsen the situation. Price controls distort markets, leading to shortages in black markets. Currency restrictions discourage foreign investment and encourage smuggling. Subsidy reforms, while economically necessary, are implemented without sufficient social protection, hitting vulnerable populations hardest. Each policy failure reinforces public skepticism and reduces compliance, weakening state authority over time. Iran's economic isolation intensifies these problems. Unlike Russia, which eventually regained access to global markets and capital, Iran remains constrained by sanctions and diplomatic tensions. Limited access to foreign investment, technology, and credit restricts growth potential. Even if oil exports increase temporarily, inflation absorbs much of the benefit. Without structural reform and reintegration, short-term gains cannot reverse long-term decline. Perhaps the most dangerous consequence of sustained inflation is the normalization of crisis. When hardship becomes routine, expectations adjust downward. People stop demanding growth and begin settling for survival. This quiet resignation may reduce open unrest, but it also erodes civic engagement and innovation. A society trapped in crisis mode struggles to envision reform, making collapse more gradual but more entrenched. Iran's inflation and bankruptcy fears are therefore not isolated economic issues. They represent a comprehensive breakdown of trust in currency, institutions, and the future. Oil revenue alone cannot reverse this trajectory. Without disciplined fiscal policy, transparent governance, and global engagement, inflation will continue to hollow out the economy from within. As history shows, once such damage reaches a critical point, recovery becomes exponentially harder. Social unrest, state pressure, and a nation under strain. As Iran's economic crisis deepens, its impact extends far beyond balance sheets and inflation charts. The collapse of oil revenue and the explosion of prices have triggered a profound social transformation. Economic hardship has reshaped how people live, think, and interact with the state. When survival becomes the central concern, social contracts weaken. In Iran today, this breakdown is visible in rising unrest, widening distrust, and an increasingly strained relationship between the government and its citizens. Economic pressure is often the spark for social instability, and Iran is no exception. When people can no longer afford food, rent, or healthcare, frustration turns into anger. Over the past several years, protests have erupted repeatedly across the country. These demonstrations are not driven by a single ideology or group. They reflect broad dissatisfaction cutting across class, age, and region. Workers demand unpaid wages, retirees protest shrinking pensions, students oppose bleak job prospects, and shopkeepers struggle with collapsing purchasing power. The common thread is economic despair. What makes this unrest particularly dangerous is its persistence. Unlike short-lived protests sparked by isolated events, Iran's demonstrations are rooted in structural problems that show no sign of resolution. Each new price hike or subsidy cut adds fuel to the fire. Even when protests are suppressed, the underlying causes remain. Silence does not mean stability. It often signals exhaustion rather than acceptance. Over time, this creates a volatile environment where even minor shocks can trigger major unrest. The government's response to social pressure has largely relied on control rather than reform. Security measures intensify whenever protests emerge, but economic policies remain unchanged. This approach may restore order temporarily, but it deepens long-term instability. When citizens feel unheard and powerless, trust in institutions erodes further. The state increasingly governs through fear rather than legitimacy, a strategy that historically proves unsustainable. Economic collapse also reshapes social behavior in quieter but equally damaging ways. Informal economies expand as people seek alternative income sources. Smuggling, black markets, and unregulated labor become survival tools rather than criminal choices. While these systems help individuals cope, they weaken state revenue and regulation, further undermining economic recovery. The government loses control over key sectors, accelerating institutional decay. One of the most profound consequences of Iran's crisis is the psychological toll on its population. Constant economic uncertainty produces stress, anxiety, and hopelessness. Mental health issues rise as people face job insecurity, debt, and declining living standards. Families delay or abandon long-term plans. Young people, in particular, feel trapped between limited opportunities at home and restricted options abroad. This emotional exhaustion erodes social cohesion and weakens resilience. Youth frustration is a critical risk factor. Iran has a relatively young population, many of whom are educated but underemployed. When expectations clash with reality, disillusionment grows. These young citizens are digitally connected, globally aware, and increasingly skeptical of official narratives. They compare their lives not to the past, but to peers elsewhere. Economic isolation makes this contrast more painful, intensifying dissatisfaction and alienation. Comparisons to Russia's collapse again provide useful perspective. In the 1990s, Russia experienced a sharp rise in crime, alcoholism, and social decay as economic structures collapsed. Iran shows early signs of similar stress, though shaped by its own cultural and political context. Economic hardship contributes to rising addiction, domestic conflict, and declining public health outcomes. These social costs rarely appear in official statistics, but they shape everyday life. Another destabilizing factor is inequality. While much of the population struggles, small segments with access to foreign currency, state connections, or monopolized industries continue to prosper. This visible inequality fuels resentment. When people perceive that hardship is unevenly distributed and corruption protects elites, anger intensifies. Economic crises become moral crises, challenging the legitimacy of governance itself. The state's financial weakness also limits its ability to manage social fallout. Welfare programs lose effectiveness as inflation erodes their value. Public sector wages fail to keep pace with costs. Infrastructure deteriorates and services decline. Citizens increasingly rely on family networks or charities rather than the government. This shift weakens the state's role in daily life, reducing its influence and authority. At the national level, sustained social pressure constrains political decision-making. Leaders prioritize survival over reform, avoiding bold changes that could destabilize power structures. This defensive posture leads to stagnation. Economic and social problems feed each other in a closed loop. Hardship fuels unrest. Unrest prompts repression. Repression discourages investment, and lack of investment deepens hardship. The risk is not sudden collapse, but gradual erosion. Institutions hollow out, trust disappears, and informal systems replace formal governance. History shows that such slow collapses are often more damaging than abrupt ones because they normalize dysfunction. Citizens adapt to crisis conditions, but adaptation comes at the cost of ambition, innovation, and unity. Iran's social strain also affects its international posture. A government under internal pressure may seek external confrontation to rally domestic support or distract from economic failure. Alternatively, it may double down on isolation to maintain control. Both paths carry risks, increasing regional tension and limiting economic recovery. Domestic weakness thus becomes a geopolitical variable, influencing behavior beyond Iran's borders. Ultimately, the social consequences of Iran's oil and economic crisis reveal a nation stretched thin. Inflation, bankruptcy fears, and declining oil revenue have moved from abstract economic debates into the fabric of everyday life. Social unrest is not an anomaly, it is a symptom. Without meaningful economic reform and political openness, pressure will continue to build beneath the surface. Iran today stands at a crossroads. One path leads toward deeper repression, informal survival, and prolonged decline. The other requires painful reform, compromise, and reintegration into the global economy. History suggests that societies can endure hardship for long periods, but endurance should not be mistaken for stability. When economic collapse reshapes social life, the consequences linger long after numbers improve. Iran's oil crisis is no longer a future warning. It is the country's present reality. What started as economic pressure has now turned into a deep structural breakdown. Oil income has weakened, inflation has surged, and the government's ability to support its people is steadily declining. Across the country, the effects are clear. Protests are rising, the middle class is shrinking, poverty is growing, and hope is fading. The real question is no longer what went wrong, but what comes next. Iran now stands at a crossroads with two possible futures: collapse or recovery. One path follows the current direction, a slow and painful decline that continues year after year. The other path requires difficult reforms, modernization, and re-engagement with the global economy. Which future becomes reality will depend on political decisions, international relations, and whether the leadership is willing to accept change. If current trends continue, Iran may enter a phase many experts describe as a managed collapse. The state would remain in control, but over a much weaker society. Oil would still be produced, yet revenues would fail to bring stability. Inflation would stay high, the currency would keep losing value, and public services would struggle to survive. Over time, daily life would shift from progress to survival. In this scenario, Iran's influence beyond its borders would also weaken. Funding regional operations and maintaining military commitments would become harder. This would not automatically create peace, but it would alter the regional balance of power. A financially strained government may become more vulnerable to pressure, yet also more unpredictable. History shows that desperation often leads to risky and unstable decisions. The second path, recovery, is far more challenging, but it is not impossible. Recovery would require serious economic reform and political flexibility. Iran would need to rebuild its oil infrastructure, improve efficiency, and reduce reliance on oil alone. Corruption would have to be addressed, transparency increased, and trust restored. Most importantly, Iran would need access to global markets and foreign investment, which would require diplomatic compromise. Rejoining the global system is not simple. Sanctions are both economic and political. To rebuild trust, Iran would need to show long-term stability and respect for international norms. This would mean changes at home and a different approach abroad. Many leaders see this as risky, fearing that openness could weaken their control. As a result, control is often chosen over reform. But without reform, the future grows darker. The state may survive, but society will continue to suffer. Opportunities will disappear, and generations will pay the price. Iran has the resources, talent, and position to succeed globally, yet these strengths remain trapped inside a failing system. For the average Iranian citizen, this means uncertainty. It means rising prices, shrinking savings, and fewer opportunities each year. It means daily life becoming harder as inflation erodes income and stability disappears. Oil, once a symbol of national strength, has become a symbol of decline. Still, there is reason for hope, not because the challenge is small, but because the Iranian people have shown resilience for decades. They have endured war, sanctions, and political turmoil. The real question is whether leadership will allow a path forward. If reform, transparency, and diplomacy are chosen, recovery is possible. If isolation continues, collapse will deepen with time. In the end, Iran's future depends on one decision, whether the state chooses to protect the people or preserve the system. Today, the system comes first, but history proves that no system survives forever if it fails its population. When trust in leadership and currency disappears, the foundation of a nation begins to crack. If you found this video informative and want to stay updated on global economic and geopolitical crises, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you clear, honest, and in-depth analysis. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.